folks, my name is Jake Pyne. I'm a Banting postdoctoral fellow at the University of Guelph and an incoming assistant professor in the York University School of Social Work in Toronto, Canada. Those are my friends. Thanks, Ito. I am famous for not talking loud enough, so maybe someone could wave their arms or something if I'm trailing off and let me know, or shriek or do something to let me know that I'm not talking loud enough. And I'm not using slides today, but I'll leave these images up because these are great readings. So in the past, I've done some work, some community-based research with trans people who are parents. That was in 2012 in Toronto. Rachel Epstein, who's here presenting later after this session, was a central part of that project. And from that, we released a community report, a follow-up legal education project about transparency and family law, to try and educate legal professionals about transparency and trying to educate trans parents about their family law rights and access to justice. And a short film called Transforming Family, which was a collaboration with the trans filmmaker Remy Bordeaux, and that short film was showing tonight. And our filmmaker later turned that short film into a feature-length documentary called Transgender Parents that aired on Canadian television in 2014. So I'm doing less work around parenting these days. My current work focuses more on the intersection of autistic and trans life, and often on time and temporality, so it was wonderful to hear Julian's talk. But this work in progress today is an attempt to think about the responses to trans reproduction in the context of historical examples of reproductive control as a practice of nation building. So my main point of interest that I'll expand on is the lineage of how trans pregnancies are treated by states. And I'm not thinking of any one state in particular, and I realize that's the context is different, but anyway, that's for now. So the lineage of how trans pregnancies are treated by states being linked not only to the way that sex change in general has been treated by states, but also to histories of reproductive violence against undesirable non-trans bodies as well. And in that context, the significance of forgetting when it comes to treating trans pregnancies as always a new emergency, a social emergency. Always the first, the only. So my title indicates that I'm focusing on youth. I often do. In the end, I went in a different direction, but we can talk about that. So reproduction holds a special place in the making of nations. Given instances of forced reproduction for some populations and forced sterilization for others, reproduction, its technologies, its politics, have been theorized as a primary vehicle for colonial citizenship formation. In the making and unmaking of trans life, the state's hand is no less visible. In North America, prior to the 1960s, the threat of transgender as a non-reproductive way of life animated concerns that were so grave that sex change technologies remained illegal in the US long after they were available in other parts of Europe. And then conversely, in some jurisdictions, trans bodies have been subject to forced sterilization, like Julian was speaking about, in order to qualify for gender transition. So at times there's hand-wringing over the fall in reproductive capacity of some people who transition, transgender in particular these days. Bioethicists and fertility clinicians have also, on the other hand, advocated withholding state assistance for trans people to reproduce. So there are grave concerns that trans bodies might not reproduce. There is also a great deal of alarm that they might. And then the question is, like, why this special and contradictory state interest? So trans legal scholar Ito Katri, who's presenting tomorrow, has written about a 2017 ruling of the European Court of Human Rights, AP versus France, in which the court anxiously notes the possibility that a trans man might come to, and this is a quote, might give birth to a child. Dum, dum, dum. So in the written legal judgment, that dire warning that a trans man might give birth to a child ends with 3 exclamation marks. And Katri writes it's the only legal judgment he's ever read that has 3 exclamation marks in it. So what I'm trying to think about, and maybe what we're all trying to think about here at this conference, is what is the meaning of those exclamation marks? How can we think about them? I think that there's no one answer to that. I think we're thinking about them in many ways. But, and I have to disappoint you again and admit that I don't have an adequate answer to that question. But I'm going to try and think about it through a number of questions. What does reproduction have to do with the nation? What does the nation have to do with trans bodies? And then how might that shed light on responses to trans reproduction that we see, that we're talking about here? So what does reproduction have to do with the nation? As I mentioned, reproduction has a really special place in the making of nations. So scholars who explore the role of reproduction in building states highlight explicit references to political interest in reproduction of citizens from ancient Athens all the way to present-day Israel. Reproductive violence has been exacted on the basis of race, class, disabilities of all kinds, so many times and in so many regions and in so many disturbing ways that Nadine Atwell writes that it is shocking how shocking we find these histories. And she says that she suggests that that forgetting is actually crucial for nation building, especially the forgetting of reproductive violence done to Indigenous people, whose very presence serves as an unpleasant reminder of a brutal past. But that forgetting is especially shocking given how recent these events are. So in the interwar period in Australia had a national policy of, quote, breeding the colour out of the nation. In Canada, via the Alberta Board of Eugenics, Indigenous men and women and disabled people were sterilised from 1928 through to 1972. In the US, the Oregon Board of Eugenics completed its last compulsory sterilisation in 1981. So this is very recent. And Atwell suggests that maybe we're repeatedly shocked by this obvious recent history because we're not accustomed to conceiving the reproductive body as, quote, a locus of national imagining and state action. But as Omi Baba reminds us, quote, the recesses of domestic space are sites for history's invasions. So eugenics, the belief in engineering so-called improved human populations through selective reproduction, was certainly a site of history's invasions. Eugenics was discredited as a set of scientific ideas, but as Curl and Caudill argue, it continues to pervade popular culture. So, and I would add, though, that while the eugenic imagination is an important arena to examine regarding reproductive violence and reproductive control, it is not the only source of those ideas, which have appeared on the right and on the left political spectrum. So the persistence of themes of reproductive control in dystopian literature and film, like The Handmaid's Tale, the film Children of Men, suggests that the place that reproduction occupies in our imagination of social engineering and state control over who does and does not enter the future. Yet, as disability studies scholar Alison Kafer notes, fantasies of reproductive engineering also persist in utopian fiction, not just dystopian fiction. So, for example, Marge Piercy's 1976 feminist classic, Woman on the Edge of Time, the depiction of a feminist future society offers multiple possible genders, multiple sexualities, and kinship formations, and yet disabled people are bred out of the populace in that utopian world, and which is a prospect that disability studies scholars and activists do not interpret as utopic. So whether we're reading futuristic literature, historical archives, or government policies spanning multiple eras, Nadine Atwell writes that reproductive acts and processes emerge as meaning-rich sites, wherein states and subjects alike can be observed registering, working out, and contesting the direction of national life. So moving on to look at what the nation has to do with trans bodies. In 1950, influential US sexologist David Caldwell declared that an individual who seeks sex change is someone who, quote, places his insane desires ahead of the rights of others. So what rights of others? In 1948, 2 years before Caldwell's statement, a trans woman called Val Berry sought sex reassignment surgery in the US state of Wisconsin, but she was denied when the state's Attorney General office warned that her surgeon would be charged with mayhem. So in their essay, King's Member, Queen's Body, Susan Stryker and Nikki Sullivan write about the little-known mayhem law lingering in the US Penal Code, lingering there from the time of British common law. And maiming or mayhem statutes were once introduced into British law to forbid the removal of limbs needed for acts of war, as the bodies of the king's subjects were considered to be the king's property. So people would at one time chop off a finger so that they wouldn't have to go to war and say, well, I'm disabled, I can't go. And that became illegal, and the answer was, no, your body does not belong to you, your body belongs to the king, to the state. So mayhem laws were a prohibition on what Stryker and Sullivan theorized as sacrificing an aspect of one's body to steal life back from the state for one's own use. So the mayhem statute was cited repeatedly across the US in the mid-20th century to discourage sex change procedures, and more than just a dramatic turn of phrase, Stryker and Sullivan suggest that mayhem signaled the nation's investment in bodily order and the continued relevance of the body politic. So the body politic meaning the metaphor of society itself comprising the body. So the body politic, the analogy of society as itself comprising a body, dates back to a wide range of early texts. It spans Plato, Shakespeare, Aesop's Fables, the New Testament, Gulliver's Travels. And the analogy has long fallen out of favor as an explicit political theory, mostly due to medicine and natural sciences now view the body as a machine. Harvey notes that despite falling out of political favor as an explicit theory, the analogy of society is itself a body continues to animate present-day social imaging with political terms like head of state, pulse of the nation, as well as militarized terms like nerve center. Discursive gestures like referring to highways as arteries, referring to using the word circulation to refer to both blood and the economy, The term members signals both body parts and people, and that those connections suggest that we continue to equate social and spatial collective, or the social and spatial collective, with the human body. So Stryker and Sullivan's exploration of the Mayhem statute, they returned to the argument that was leveled against sex change as an act that destroys bodily integrity of those who undergo it. That was the term that was used at the time. And they offer instead that we ought to consider the problematic of the modified body to be one of integration, not integrity, so the inability to be integrated into the nation. Or I would say the ability or inability, because I think at this time there is an ability for some trans people to be integrated. And indeed, Dan Irving notes that transsexuals and their self-appointed minders have aspired to the incorporation of trans bodies into capitalist labor pools many times. There's lots of examples of that. Christine Jorgensen was famously quite expert at positioning herself within ideas that were very popular at the time in America. The triumph of science over nature, and the importance of the individual over the looming kind of socialist threat, etc. So trans people play into that as well, to get their own needs met. In the 1940s and 50s, nearly all those presenting at gender clinics were male to female. Irving writes that critics objected to sex change as a whole, both on the grounds of loss of potential male productivity, but also the loss of potential of female reproductivity. So at that time, Irving points out that doctors who were charged with assessing transsexuals for sex change often took into consideration economic factors like aptitude, earning potential, education, and class background, because they didn't see themselves just as minders of individual bodies. They understood their roles as caretakers of a greater societal good, or stewards of, quote, the vitality of the nation. The 1949 influential U.S. sexologist Alfred Kinsey decreed that sex change should not be permitted at all because it would eliminate the body's reproductive capacities. Caldwell also weighed in that it would be criminal to remove reproductive organs, and so criminal to allow sex change. And so at times reproduction is explicitly visible as very central in the kind of imagined nation that trans people are trial members in. So how might that national interest in the trans body shed light on responses to trans reproduction? The lingering logics of mayhem, if not in the legal sense, then in the colloquial sense of chaos or havoc, saturate reactions to trans pregnancies. And I think we're hearing that here. Yesterday's amazing panel, Pregnancy in the Limelight, made that clear with respect to the media doorstepping of pregnant trans men, as it was described. Cyrus Marcus Ware characterized the incredulity about his pregnant body with the statement, "Pregnant man claims he is a pregnant man." Incredulity and panic about trans pregnancy permeates the debates that have taken place among fertility clinicians in academic journals and elsewhere regarding whether or not they should permit trans people to be parents at all. And state panic specifically can be seen in law and legislation. So the history of disturbing family court rulings in the US and the UK involving trans parents absolutely reeks of panic and punishment. Ito Kachi writes that the law is clearly anxious about the reproductive capabilities of trans people. And how else should we understand the 3 exclamation marks that follow the European Court of Human Rights judgment when merely noting the possibility that trans men could give birth to a child? Mandatory sterilization laws for trans people seeking legal recognition of their gender, though ruled a human rights violation by the European Court of Human Rights in 2017, that those mandatory sterilizations have existed and they persist across regions of the world. Incoherent legal gender recognition policies for trans men who've given birth have pushed them into what Stephen Whittle calls legal outer space. And though these state-imposed incoherencies, like Yuval's need to change his sex 6 times that he mentioned yesterday, those state-imposed incoherencies could be legally resolved, but they will not, writes Ito Kachi. So the importance of that they could be resolved or not, I think, is what we need to look at. So a few possibilities. State panic over trans bodies relates to, I think, to the historical treatment of trans people in general, or to sex change in general, treated as though trans people don't have or should not have authority over their bodies. But it also relates strongly to the history of reproductive violence against non-trans people as well, indigenous peoples, black and other racialized communities, disabled people, poor people. Anxiety about reproductive possibilities is not new, it's not trans-specific, and reflects the history of the idea of the body politic and the state's ownership of the body that was once explicit and once very visible in mayhem laws. So an important question, I think, is how state reactions to trans reproduction differ on the basis of the race, disability, class with respect to the trans person in question. Latina trans poet and activist Morgan Robin Collado suggests that the staggering levels of violence against trans women of color is itself an issue of reproductive justice, because that violence foreshortens their futures and foreshortens their future families. I also think it's worth considering, further considering the act of forgetting as it relates to trans pregnancies. Frances White spoke yesterday about the media panic over pregnant trans men and how there have actually been 3 first pregnant men in the UK. But what Frances called a cultural amnesia prevents this from being remembered. And as I noted earlier, in the context of reproductive violence done to Indigenous peoples in many colonial contexts, Abel writes that forgetting is crucial to nation building, and that Indigenous people are undesirable reminders, unsightly stains, according to the states that attempt to govern them. So a question would be, might trans people who are pregnant be responded to with panic because they too serve as reminders that something about the premise of sex and gender is false, exposed, unjust as well, of course, and so incoherent policies and laws will be left intact to ensure that those bodies are treated as social emergencies each and every time and never belong. So to close, despite the disturbing nature of this topic, I think we should also take heart that a lot of the national reproductive control programs that I mentioned could also be seen to have failed in their intent. So disability, community, and culture thrives in many places. The color has not been, quote, bred out of our various national contexts. And so too the attempts to control trans bodies via reproduction also, fortunately, can fail. And that's not to say that no damage is done. Damage is very much done. But personally, I'm taking heart from Yuval's panel yesterday when he recalled being told by Israeli officials that he could not have any more babies, and then held up his newborn baby and said, well, here she is. So I think that I'm gonna end it there, and we can cover more things in the questions. Thank you.